Someone said something which I thought was quite wise years ago, and I've always remembered that in a way. He said, don't tell people how bad their church is, tell them how good Orthodoxy is. So I think people have got to be aware that Orthodoxy, in fact, is the one true Church of Christ, which has been unaltered and unchanged, and is still proclaiming the same things which the apostles taught.
The St. Edward Brotherhood, which is part of the Church of the Genuine Orthodox Christians of Greece, was founded in 1982 to act as custodians of the sacred relics of St. Edward the Martyr, King of England, which were enshrined at Brookwood, Surrey in 1984. The relics had been presumed lost during the dissolution under Henry VIII, but were discovered by John Wilson Claridge in 1931, who later donated them to the Orthodox Church. We were given a blessing to interview Father Niphon, one of the monks of the Brotherhood. This show is called Tea Time at the Seminary, so it makes sense that we would have an episode in England. That's where we are today. We are in Brookwood, England, with Father Niphon, who is one of the monks here at the St. Edward's Brotherhood. So thank you for coming on the show today.
Thank you very much, Timothy.
So Father Niphon, I have wanted to come to the Brotherhood here in Brookwood for quite a long time now, to have tea with someone here, to talk a little bit about the Brotherhood. And it looks like we have some nice tea here. What kind of tea is this here?
Now this is a commercial blend called Yorkshire tea, and it's quite a strong tea. I think it's a mixture of mostly Indian tea and some China tea.
Looks very good. And then we also have the cakes here. Of course, we are in England, so this is going to be proper tea we're going to be drinking.
English.
Yeah, we've had the American tea for long enough, I suppose. It's time we actually had some English tea. Not Earl Grey. I was expecting Earl Grey, but Yorkshire is very English as well. Father Niphon, we're going to talk a little bit about the Brotherhood, of course, because we are here at the Brotherhood. So I would like to know a little bit about how the Brotherhood started, because from what I understand, it's actually a very interesting story, considering the story about the relics of St. Edward.
The Brotherhood was founded in 1982, and Father Alexis, the abbot here, was the founder of the Brotherhood. It was blessed by St. Philaret of New York, and then later Bishop Gregory of Manhattan came to receive the relics, but it was with the blessing of St. Philaret. And so Father Alexis known St. Philaret many years before the Boston Monastery was ordained deacon and priest. And so St. Philaret, in a way, was a principal guider. And the Brotherhood was founded to look after the relics of St. Edward the Martyr, and also to have a missionary witness in England. And at that time, Orthodoxy in England was known, but not very much. And so people were starting to get interested in Orthodoxy, but in a way which is much more so now. This was back in the 1980s, and so at that time, what was known about Orthodoxy as well was seen very much as being an ethnic church for people who were Greek or Russian or from the Balkans, but not for any English converts really very much. And so that was the main reason for the foundation of St. Edward Brotherhood, to look after the relics of St. Edward, to care for the church, and also to have a missionary witness, and to promote Orthodoxy.
And so how did we find ourselves in Brookwood, England, as opposed to London or some other city?
Yeah, that's actually a very practical question in a way, because Father Alexis is from Somerset, and the other fathers, one's local, but it's not part of the country we'd have chosen, as it's Surrey is particularly not the interesting part of England really. But the reason was that Father Alexis discovered that the two cemetery chapels were available, they were up for sale, and at that time the cemetery was privately owned, and the owner at the time was selling off various parts of land in various chapels. And so these two chapels, which we're in now, was the original Anglican Cemetery Chapel that was built in 1854. And this was where all the Victorian funerals took place. And it was consecrated as an Anglican Cemetery Chapel by Dr. Sumners, who was Bishop of Winchester, and he was later Archbishop of Canterbury. His wife founded Mothers' Union. And Dr. Summers was obviously of a rather Protestant mentality because he had the chapel deliberately facing west rather than east. And so this was the original cemetery chapel, and it was used until 1908. And then the one next door, which we now use as our church, was built. And that was because this one, I think, was probably not considered grand enough. But fortuitously, when that was built, was facing east. And so that solved a lot of problems for us with the worship in the church, and with we're able to have a proper eastward-facing altar.
And for people who don't know, what's the significance of the altar facing the east as opposed to the western side?
I think there's a number of significances for that, but also the sun, of course, rises in the east and sets in the west. And so Jesus Christ, Son of Righteousness, and also Jerusalem is facing east, and so one prays facing east. And tradition of early Christians was to pray facing east. So Orthodox Christians have icons on the east wall if possible, and pray facing east. Mm-hmm. And the fact that this church was facing was obviously a direct rejection of all of that.
It's the complete opposite, quite literally.
Yes.
But so we're in a cemetery right now, or at least this the property here is on top of a cemetery.
Yes.
And what is the story behind that? I mean, I know that there is. I think from what I was told a few days ago, it sounds like there was a man who donated the relics, or I guess gave the relics to the monastery, and he was also buried here as well.
The fact that then the cemetery is, in fact, because the two chapels were available for purchase, but also the cemetery, in fact, was founded in 1854 to provide graves of people from London who died. At that time in London, the cemeteries were overfull. They were in a very poor state. People being buried 3 or 4 in one grave meant for perhaps 1 or 2 people, so it was a very bad situation. This land here was purchased by the London Necropolis Company, basically to make a lot of money on people buying graves in the cemetery. This fell flat because up the road a few miles away is the first crematorium in England, and so that was also opened fairly soon after the cemetery was opened. So the number of burials which were supposed to have taken place here were obviously a lot less than were envisaged, because the crematorium started to take over from the cemetery. So there was a rivalry between the cemetery and the crem, and this meant there was a lot of land which wasn't being used for burial, and the cemetery company eventually sold off a lot of the land, which is now part of Guildford, part of Woking, and now the cemetery is 500 acres rather than the 2,000 acres envisaged. And but I think you're asking also about the relics of St Edward. How did they come to be here?
Yes, because we were wondering, because even with the question about the monastery being in Brookwood,
yes.
How did the relics get here? I guess would be the big question.
Well, John Edward Wilson Claridge, who found the relics at the time he was owner of Shaftesbury Abbey, and he was also an amateur archaeologist, and he found the relics. Now, this is all in this book, which was published last year by the St Edward Brotherhood and written by Father Thomas, and all the questions, all the answers about St Edward and the canon to St Edward and the miracles of St Edward are included in this book. So it's all very comprehensive and up to date.
And I was able to get a copy of this book when I was here actually the other day.
Yes.
So it was very helpful because I'll be honest with you that I know that England has had many saints. St. Edward, though, I only really knew that he was a martyr and a little bit about the story of when he became a martyr, but nothing really before that.
No. In fact, St. Edward was one of the later Anglo-Saxon saints, because England became Christian. Well, there were Christian missions from the 1st century. From first Bishop of Britain was St Aristobulus, one of the 70 disciples. He was the brother of St Barnabas, and at that time, very soon after that, there was an English mission started, and there were 3 bishops, English bishops or British bishops, because England didn't exist then, present at the first ecumenical council. Their names are mentioned, and they were present, and they went, and the file was commemorated as the first council. And in a place called Hinton St Mary, which is about over 100 miles from here, it's a small village. There was unearthed in the 1940s a mosaic which had the face of Christ on. It was from late Roman times, and it's one of the earliest, I think the earliest mosaic showing the face of Christ in the West. And this was found in the West Country, a place called Hinton St Mary, not far from Blandford Forum. And mosaic was discovered by someone putting clothes posts into the garden. Luckily they were educated enough to realise they'd found something. They said, I think we'd better get an archaeologist to look at this, and they did. And they excavated the mosaic and they found the face of Christ and the four evangelists. And it's very early because he's shown as a beardless youth, and also with a carreau behind his head. And it was on the ground, and the Ecumenical Council decided that no portrayal of Christ or the cross should be on the ground, so this predates it before that. It was very, very early. And so there was a Christian mission in England at that time, and then later were many saints whose lives are, the names are known, but not their lives aren't really very known. Later on, I think in about the 5th or 6th century, the Anglo-Saxons invaded, and they were pagan, and they destroyed a lot of the ancient Christian churches and so on. They later converted to Christianity, as is known by the dialogues of St Gregory the Great. And England became fervently Christian, and then the lives of Anglo-Saxon saints are much better documented, especially by St Bede the Venerable, who wrote the lives of many of the saints. And St Edward's life, he was one of the last of the, there were many Anglo-Saxon saints after him, but he was one of the last whose lives are really well known. And
he died in the 900s, right?
He was martyred in 978 or 979. There's a dispute about that, and that's mentioned in the book. And so some people, I think most would say 978, and some would say 979. It's not proven which is the exact date. There was a dispute if someone had crossed out something in a manuscript and then overwritten it. So, but that is mentioned in here in this book.
And you mentioned that England became sort of fervently Christian. There was a point where the whole country sort of became a huge Christian nation, and we were talking about how there are actually many more saints besides St. Edward in England. But I guess something I'm wondering about is how come England is not really a country you think of when you think of Christianity anymore? Because the history is really it's very deep Christian history.
Yeah, I think there's three big things which affected the whole of English history. One was the Norman Conquest in 1066, and the Norman Conquest was blessed by the Pope at the time to bring the British Church into line with continental Catholicism, and what remained of Orthodoxy after the Norman Conquest was pretty much destroyed. There were still married priests in England even after the Norman Conquest, but by about the end of the 11th century it had all totally disappeared. The whole ethos, the whole way of worship had utterly changed. And so that was one of the major things. They had also what was called the Harrowing of the North, when all of northern England was burned or destroyed and salt put onto the soil to destroy it. And so many of the relics of the saints also were destroyed because the Normans said, well, if they're relics of saints, they won't burn. If they are relics of real saints, they'll be unburned. And so they put them into the fire, and many of the saints' relics were burned by the Norman conquerors from the ancient times, the ancient Saxon and British saints. And so the Norman conquest was one of the greatest upheavals in English history, because the whole ethos, the whole climate, the whole mentality of people was changed. Then later, the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century destroyed a lot of what remained. The monasteries were destroyed, as we know from St Edward's Relics being a monastery of Shaftesbury. The abbeys were destroyed, many of the relics of the saints again were destroyed, and most of them were lost. And there was an iconoclastic period under Henry's son Edward, who deliberately had all the churches whitewashed with frescoes destroyed, and again most of the history was lost. And then also, unfortunately, in the 19th century, perhaps it's a very different thing, but you had the Industrial Revolution, and that was when many people were turning away from what remained of Christianity towards secularism and the belief that man had the future, that all things could be found according to man's understanding rather than God's. You had Darwin, and you had evolution, and you had that whole ethos. And so that also helped to pave the way for destruction of England.
So when people come to the monastery here, do they think maybe you're Catholic monks, or are they confused when you say I'm Orthodox Christian?
I think a lot of people come here. A few years ago, a lot of them knew nothing about Orthodoxy at all, but now many people contact us by the internet or by email, and they've read about Orthodoxy, they've read about English history a little bit, and they want to know not so much about English history, but about Orthodoxy. You know, why many of them have been through Roman Catholicism or Anglicanism or evangelical Protestantism, or in fact nothing, and they want to know about Orthodoxy, what it has to offer, why is it different. Because many people in England now, most people in England probably have no religious upbringing at all. I think the majority probably of religious people in England now would be Muslim, and among Christians would be Roman Catholic or evangelical Protestants, and the Church of England itself now is a minority really of people actually go to church. Most Anglican churches have very, very few people going. In fact, over 25 years ago now, the Isle of Wight, one of the leading Anglican clergymen, was converted to Orthodoxy and joined our parish, and he was he'd been rural dean on the Isle of Wight. He was baptised, chrismated, and joined our church, and sadly he died after a few years. But only very fairly recently we've had an Anglican clergyman and his family been received as catechumens, and they're undergoing instruction now. So many people now in the Church of England are looking towards something more stable and more historically ancient. Yeah, it's interesting actually also because when we first came to Brookwood, the parish was very small, and there was mostly a few elderly English converts and a couple of families. But now, over the years, it's grown out of all recognition. And then also many people came from various ethnic communities, Greek, Russian, Ukrainian, Romanian, Bulgarian. And of course, most of the younger people now, a lot of them don't speak their own languages. They speak English as the first language. And so partly that's why people came, and also more recently because many people have been tired of the ecumenism or modernism in the other churches. They've come here to be traditionally Orthodox. And then in the last few years we've had quite a number of people coming from non-denominational backgrounds and finding Orthodoxy and being interested, and then deciding to join us. And so it's from very varied ethnic and religious backgrounds.
Well, what's the number of people that typically come, would you say?
Oh, well, we don't get the same people every week because a lot of people travel from quite a distance. We have some people come from the Isle of Wight, and then some from North Yorkshire, and others from Scotland, and from various parts of England, so it's quite a journey. And they come, perhaps the ones from Scotland and far away will come for major feasts and as much as they can. And then the other people will come every other week, or people live locally come pretty much every week and during the week. The people who live further away come every other week, or as much as they can afford to come. But unfortunately in England, transport is expensive and it's difficult.
And Father Niphon, you have been a monk here for how many years, would you say?
Well, I came here in, when was it, 1985. I was in Greece for a few years before that. And then Father Sabbas came next year, I think 86 or 87. And so slowly it's grown. And we had some people came and then decided it wasn't for them. And so over a period of time it's grown.
Since there are people that are coming, what are some things you usually say to people who just kind of, because I would imagine there are a lot of people who just walk by and just see the church and say, oh, what's this all about? Do you have sort of a set list of things you would say to someone like that, or you sort of just like you let it go out wherever it is?
Someone said something which I thought was quite wise years ago, and I've always remembered that in a way. He said, don't tell people how bad their church is, tell them how good Orthodoxy is. And and it seems in a way rather strange thing to say, but I think very often people who, particularly back in the 1990s, a lot of disillusioned Anglicans came. They didn't really want to be Orthodox. They wanted to be Anglican without women priests or without the change of the service. And the same with, unfortunately, some traditional Roman Catholics wanted to become Orthodox. They really wanted traditional Catholicism without the changes, but didn't want to become Orthodox. And so a lot of people we found at that time would say, well, we like this, we like that, we don't really like this, we're not happy with this. And so they never really became Orthodox. Some didn't get that far even at all, and some who did didn't stay. So I think people have got to be aware that Orthodoxy, in fact, is the one true Church of Christ, which has been unaltered and unchanged, and is still proclaiming the same things which the apostles taught from apostolic times and the early church taught. And I think if people are aware of that, then they can see that other things follow on from that. And I think also becoming Orthodox isn't simply, how can I put it, following a change of attitudes, change of ideas. It's a whole change of life. And so in a way you have to accept a different form of behaviour, a different mentality. And becoming Orthodox and being Anglican or Roman Catholic or even genital Protestant is a huge change. And in some ways it's easier for people who know nothing than people who've had to change from being what they were. And that takes longer.
I was also going to ask you, so we have St. Edward's icon in the back here. So with the relics, have there been any miracles that we know of that have happened within the past 30 years or so?
Yes. There's 2 or 3 which I can think of. Many years ago, when I visited the Holy Land, there was a young man there who was in the Russian mission there, and he was saying that someone who he'd known who was Bulgarian, who was brought up in communist times, hadn't been baptized and wanted to be baptized, and his name was Edward. And he spoke to the Greek priest who was going to baptize him, and the priest said, you must have another name. Edward is not your name, is not the name to have, he's not an Orthodox saint. And now I can't remember exactly if the man or the priest, but there was a vision, one of them had a vision of St. Edward and said, your name is Edward. And I am Orthodox, and they had this vision of St. Edward Martyr and said, my name is Edward, and the priest immediately baptized this man as Edward. And that was back in about 1997 I heard that. And it's mentioned in the book. And then also very recently, there was a lady in our parish who was going blind in one eye, and the consultant had said that it was unlikely she'd keep her sight. And then he said, I think you have to prepare that you're going to go blind and you must get used to having sight in just one eye. And she took some oil from St. Edward's lamp, one of the fathers here suggested it, and she anointed her eye with oil. And then she went back to the consultant, and she said, I don't understand what's happened. This is a miracle of God, because your eye is totally fine. It needs no medication, nothing. Your sight is perfect. And she could see perfectly out of both eyes. And she was a Muslim, so only God could have done this.
Is St. Edward the patron saint of eyesight by any chance?
No, not really, I think, but many miracles happened with that.
Yeah.
And also there's, on the icon of Mother of God in the church, from many years ago now, there's a little silver ear hanging from it. And there was a Greek girl who came here and she was going deaf. And she had oil from St. Edward, and her hearing improved so much so she didn't need to have anything done. And so she gave a silver ear, which is on the icon of Mother of God, on the iconostas. And these are very recent miracles. And then, many miracles have happened with St. Edward, people praying and being anointed with oil from above his shrine. So it's happening all the time.
From what I understand, he's kind of known as a champion of the monastics.
Yes.
Yes. Can you explain to our audience why that's the case?
Well, St. Edward was killed at the instigation of Queen Elfrida, who was his stepmother, and she was the second wife of King Edgar the Peaceable. And very often the murder of St. Edward is seen as something which was dynastic, but it wasn't. It was partly that, but also to do with running the country. And St Edward's spiritual father was St Dunstan, who was Archbishop of Canterbury and had been abbot of Glastonbury. And St Dunstan was, spent many years, he'd travelled to the continent. He was, after the Viking invasions, a lot of monasteries had been destroyed and the church had become quite moribund. And a lot of monasteries were being used by the secular clergy. And they were being used for their families to live in, and the monastic life had become rather very downtrodden and not in a very good state. St Dunstan had been and seen the continental monasteries and had been inspired by St Benedict's rule, and he wanted very much to introduce the rule of St Benedict into English monasteries. And St Dunstan was also very reform-minded. When he'd been young, when St Edward had been young, he'd been the regent, and he'd introduced reforms in the church to make discipline stricter, to make monastic life more applicable, more part of the country. And he'd done very good things, and also introducing proper rule in church chanting. And he'd done many things to promote the church. Queen Elfrida was very jealous that her son wouldn't inherit the kingdom. Also, she was supporting the secular clergy and her friends having monastic land. And so she arranged for St Edward, when he visited Corfe Castle during Lent, she met him at the door of the castle, presented him with bread and wine, and then while he was drinking wine, he was stabbed in the back by her retainers. And it says in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles, no worse crime had happened in English history, because it was seen that the very person who should be protecting the monarch, his stepmother, was also giving him hospitality. And in the Anglo-Saxon tradition, if you gave someone bread and wine, it meant that you were looking after them, you were going to care for them and protect them. And she had broken all these rules of tradition. She had murdered the anointed of God, and also she had murdered her stepson and someone whom she was meant to be protecting. And so this is why St Edward was seen as a protector of monasteries, because he was very keen on following through the reforms of his father Edgar the Peaceable, and also taking the advice of his spiritual father St Dunstan. And St Edward was also murdered during Lent, because had he lived until Lent, the probability is that he would have had an appropriate wife and had a family, and so Queen Elfrida had to murder him before Pascha, before he had a chance to marry and have a family. And so this was another reason for it seemed particularly nasty murder. And said that when King Ethelred the Unready, before he was king, heard of the murder, he started to cry, and Queen Elfrida picked up a handful of beeswax candles and beat him soundly with them. And after that he had a fear of light, and so he couldn't read. He was called the Unready because he was unable to read, unread, unlettered, as well as being unprepared for the later Viking invasions. St Dunstan prophesied also that when this happened, that people who had no love of the country and no love of the British realm would take it over, which happened with the Norman conquest. It's ironical also that Queen Elfrida eventually died as a monastic, because she went to Shaftesbury to venerate the relics of St Edward, and when she tried to cross over the threshold of the abbey, several times she was pushed back by an invisible hand and fell onto the ground. And it's said that she went dressed in purple with a crown, and she took off her purple, took off her crown, and put ashes on her head and put on black, and she died in a convent outside of Andover called Werrell, which she founded in reparation for the murder of St Edward. And so she died as monastic, and this is quite ironical, really. She died in old age, but there's a different account of how she died, but she died as a nun, and she built the convent in reparation. So prayers we said all the time for her and commemoration of St Edward.
Also, something I wanted to mention before I forget. So with St Edward and the relics, many people will walk into the church and they'll venerate the relics. And I think if you're not an Orthodox Christian, you might look at the veneration of relics as a very strange practice. Because to someone who's not Orthodox, you're seeing someone bowing down to a body part and then kissing it. Now, can you explain to us why the Orthodox Christians venerate relics and why this is not a strange thing as many people might think it is.
Of course, it goes back to the Old Testament as well, when the prophet Elias says his relics were, his body was uncovered, and immediately started to work miracles. And then also, early Christians, the catacombs, had remains of the first martyrs there, and the liturgy was celebrated over these relics, over these bodies of the saints. And so we believe that the Holy Spirit indwells in the Christian's body, but particularly after death and body of a saint. And so by venerating the relics of the saint, the honour also shown to the body passes to the prototype, which is Jesus Christ, but also the grace of the Holy Spirit indwells in the relics. And so by venerating the relics, we are, in a sense, partaking of that grace of the Holy Spirit. And so when miracles happen, this is really not surprising, because the Holy Spirit is acting through remains of the saints. And this is something in England before in ancient times, there were so many relics of saints. All the St. Benedict Biscop travelled several times to Rome and brought back relics of martyrs, brought back many relics of the saints, and including, I think, St. Peter. And then later on, many of the Anglo-Saxon and Celtic saints travelled, and they travelled to Rome, to the Holy Land, and brought back relics with them. And these were things which were venerated, particularly out of all of England. And then the relics of the ancient English saints were venerated, and St. Alban's Abbey, they had, until the Reformation, the relics of St. Alban. And his relics were regarded as one of the prime shrines in England. And St. John Maximovich, when he came to England, he'd always go to St. Alban's Abbey to pray at the shrine of St. Alban. And in fact, very recently, I think in the last 20 or 30 years, some relics were given back to the shrine from Cologne in Germany, where they had some relics of St. Alban. And so St. Alban was one of the very great British saints. He was Romano-British from very early times. His life and martyrdom is recorded in St. Bede's History of English People. And St. Alban's shrine was one of the great shrines throughout all of England. It was known throughout all of Europe as well. And then there's many Anglo-Saxon saints whose relics were venerated. Many shrines of the saints, Alban, were venerated until the Reformation time, when all the relics were, most of them were burned or deliberately destroyed. Fortunately, some were saved by being taken to the continent, and in Rome they had relics of all the many of the saints, and so a lot were saved in Rome or in Germany and Italy. So some of the ancient relics do remain still. And in our church we have relics of the early Christian martyrs, and also we have a tiny fragment of St. Augustine of Canterbury, which was given to us by someone who'd been a Roman Catholic monk and became Orthodox, and he gave us this relic, one of the few surviving relics of St. Augustine of Canterbury. And we have that in the glass shrine in the church. And then we have...
I didn't know that. I saw the array of relics. I didn't know that was St. Augustine was part of that too.
And then we have a tiny fragment of St. Bede the Venerable, which came from Rome, and also we have relics of the Holy Apostle Peter, the Holy Cross, St. Lazarus before they died, and St. Job of Porchaev, St. Pantaleon, the great martyr, many different relics. And thank God we're able to have them in the glass shrine to venerate them.
And just to clarify for those who are unsure about relics, we're not worshipping the relics when we kiss it or when we do prostration.
Yes. As St. John of Damascus says, the honour shown to the icon passes to a prototype, which is Jesus Christ. But the same with the relics of the saints. When we venerate the relics, we're honouring Christ through the relics of the saint, and therefore receiving the grace of the Holy Spirit, which comes through venerating the remains of the relics of the saints.
So sort of similar to an icon, I guess.
Where
it's a window to heaven.
Yes. Yeah. And today, in fact, is 14 years since our church was consecrated, and that was for us one of the greatest events. Well, the greatest event really in our church. And in the altar table, we had tiny fragments of St. Edward the Martyr, the martyrs of Prevlac, who were killed in the 16th century in Montenegro, and by the Roman Catholics, where relics were discovered, I think, in the last 30 years. We have a tiny fragment of them, and also St. Elizabeth, Grand Duchess, and we have a relic of her in the Holy Table. And so these are the 3 saints are particularly special for us. And today, in fact, is the anniversary, 14 years ago, of that consecration.
Yes, actually, on the filming of this day just happens to be. Yeah.
And which was consecrated by Metropolitan Ambrose, by Bishop Johannes from Sweden, who's died some years ago now, and Bishop Dionysi and Bishop Sophronian from Romania. And they all signed the cloth. And then also we had 2 Russian deacons, Father, 2 deacons, one from France and one from Australia, and several clergy as well. So all the churches were represented, all the traditional churches at that time.
So a lot of relics, a lot of history here in England, not just at Brookwood, but just in England in general. In fact, if you go to England, you could make it a pilgrimage, I guess, because there's so many locations. Canterbury, for example.
And even relics of some of the saints are known where they are, but they're covered and they're underground, so you can't actually venerate them, just pray at their shrines. And
Oxford has a saint too, right?
Yes, it has St. Fritzwides of Oxford, and I think she's buried in Christ Church Cathedral, but her relics are mixed with those of the wife of, I think, a Protestant Italian reformer who came to England, and they deliberately mixed her bones with St. Fritzwides, so we wouldn't be able to venerate the relics.
St. Fritzwide, so she's
an ancient Anglo-Saxon saint.
Anglo-Saxon saint, yeah.
And she was regarded as the foundress of Oxford. And so there's relics of her, but also there's, throughout all of England, there's shrines for saints. And even some of the relics may well remain being buried underground and perhaps discovered one day. But there were so many saints in England. There were 20,000 martyrs in Lichfield, and there were thousands of martyrs in all different parts of England from Roman time, particularly from Viking invasions, and the many thousands of martyrs all over England, and many saints whose lives are recorded, and a lot whose lives aren't recorded.
Wow.
A lot of the names are just known, but not their lives.
Father Niphon, if someone wants to visit Brookwood or to visit the monastery in particular, how should they contact the monastery? What's the best way?
Oh, well, I suppose if they're local or in England, or by telephoning.
Telephone.
And but if they're coming from abroad, I suppose by emailing.
Email. And you can find all that information on the website.
Exactly.
The Brotherhood St. Edward.
Yes.
So
yes.
We'll link that in the description of the video so that it's easy for people to find. Like I said, I've wanted to visit this place for quite a while now, so it's kind of surreal to actually be here now and to see the church and to see the community here. But I do want to say thank you very much for this interview, and thank you very much for this tea, which is I'm finally able to have English tea, like proper. You know?
I'm glad you enjoyed it. Thank you very much for coming.
Yeah, very much so.
Thank you. Cheers.